My name is David Hart. I'm the director here. So now it's my pleasure to introduce today's speakers, Darren Ranco, Chuck Loring, and Betsy Cook. We have some amazing Wabanaki faculty and students at Maine, and it's been, for me personally, very exciting to watch them take on important leadership roles inside this university, across Wabanaki and beyond. And from the day I first met Darren Ranco more than 19 years ago, it was obvious that he was the kind of leader who could build innovative collaborations between Native peoples and other important partners. Of course, such collaborations are only as strong as the partners themselves. And today's panel is an excellent example of a creative confluence of Indigenous leaders and leaders from the conservation world. Chuck Loring is the director of the Department of Natural Resources at the Penobscot Nation and a Maine alum. Great to have him with us. Betsy Cook has been working on conservation issues in New England for a long time and is the Maine State Director at the Trust for Public Land. And of course, Darren is both a professor here at Maine and a citizen of the Penobscot Nation. Together, they will explore a very important question: why return land to Indigenous nations without restriction? So this is a discussion on Wáhsehtəkᵂ that they'll tell you all about, and Wabanaki Land Trust partnerships. Please join me in welcoming Chuck, Betsy, and Darren.
Good afternoon, everyone. We'll pull up some slides. Basically, the structure of today is I'm going to run through some slides in the first 15 minutes. If I say anything wrong, my colleagues will correct me. The bulk of the time will be in conversation, exploring the exact issues that David alluded to in the introduction. So I'll get right to it here. See if I can advance it. There we go. Okay, so goals for today. I do want to introduce the concepts of land return and rematriation, the concept of the Wáhsehtəkᵂ project. I also want to give a little bit of context of how this project fits into stolen lands legacy across our territory and what is now called Maine. We'll hear from Chuck and Betsy about what the project means for both Penobscot Nation and for Trust for Public Land. And then discuss as well, like why this land return or land return projects having without restrictions like conservation easements, why that's important to our collective work. So that should be awesomely fun. People know about land return and the land back movement. I think it's really hard to separate out conservation work or the land protection work or even the climate change adaptation work that we're engaged in as Indigenous peoples, or even thinking about our own sovereignty or economic security without thinking about land return and the possibilities of land return. It intersects with so many things that we're engaged in. This is definitely one of those things where I was like, where's the quote that captures that? And then it's like, oh yeah, that sounds good. And then I realized like that was me. I said that. It really made a lot of sense to me when I found that quote about how land return intersects with all these things. So, yeah, I do want to say, like, besides quoting myself, there is just last week the Maine Center for Economic Policy released a report about tribal sovereignty, which links with into again the work of land return and land care by Wabanaki people. Here, and these are just like some select quotes from the report, but it talks about the future prosperity of Maine being tied to justice for Wabanaki nations, and that obviously respect for tribal sovereignty has seen stronger growth and more resilient communities in states that support that. In addition to recognizing tribal sovereignty, increasing the amount of trust land held by the Wabanaki nations is foundational to realizing the economic gains other federally recognized tribes and their non-tribal neighbors have enjoyed. And with around 95% of land in Maine privately owned, the greatest potential for returning land to the Wabanaki Nations will be through purchase or donation agreements with private landowners. But that's really the context of like, how is it linking to sovereignty and our tribal sovereignty? And this report does a great job at kind of capturing that as well. So really briefly, you know, to me, land back or land return and rematriation are interconnected projects. You know, to me, they both center what Indigenous people call right relations between humans and non-humans. Land back is sometimes referred to as hashtag land back, emphasizes the return of everything stolen from us as Indigenous peoples through colonization: land, language, ceremony, medicines, kinships, connections, et cetera, et cetera. It's a very explicitly kind of political movement, whereas rematriation has been part of core cultural movements by Indigenous people for quite some time. And it really is consciously centering women in tradition, not men in property. And it's definitely an emphasis on healing versus like a return per se. Like, so healing is the primary element of rematriation, but it often requires things like land return in order to make those healing relationships whole again. You know, when we think about this work, you know, in January 2021, the Wabanaki tribal nation governments in what is now called Maine created the Wabanaki Commission on Land and Stewardship. Each of the tribal governments appoints 2 people to the commission. I and a number of other people who are connected to the university help support the commission, but in and of itself is its own nonprofit, but also centers the work around land return with land trust partners across the state. Just so people understand the background, when we think of ourselves as Wabanaki, it's not just the state of Maine that we think about. We think about all of our relations across the Wabanaki, the larger Wabanaki territory, and sort of we center our work in relationship across those places and across those different nations. So it's really important that while at times we feel kind of stuck in this box of Maine, when we think about our land care traditions, and I know you know, Natalie was here, you know, like that the idea that we bring knowledge sharers from across our territory to help us with this work, it's very important to kind of how we think about it. There's also this history of, as you probably all know, land theft or seizure of our lands through the colonial apparatus starting in the 17th century. One thing that I pointed out, and this is through the Dawn Land Return website, you can see this sort of map of like our lands disappearing and then conservation lands coming in, you know, there's usually a lag time between those things. But when I looked at this map and saw where the bulk of these lands are conserved through parks or easements or other things in the state of Maine, I was struck with how it overlapped with this map, which in the shaded areas shows lands taken from our tribes because of illegal treaties signed after 1790. And that's a legacy of 12 million acres taken. And this forms the basis of a Settlement Act from 1980, and we can talk more about that. But you know, that really is an interesting kind of overlap when I think about like how has the conservation movement and protection of lands sort of benefited, quote unquote, from theft of our lands. Critical to our work has been the rise of the First Light group, which is a group of conservation organizations in the state of Maine that have formed around really working with Indigenous people and Wabanaki people. And this work started in a formal way in 2017, 2018. You can see sort of inklings of it in the previous 20 years with projects between Maine Coast Heritage Trust and the Passamaquoddy tribe on protecting petroglyphs, work by TNC and other conservation groups with the Penobscot River Restoration Project, but really formalizing into like, we need to go full force in land relations and conservation work partnering with Indigenous people here in Maine, and you can see that. So it's really self-consciously the First Light learning journey. It's about training people and sort of how to work with and what is important in working with Wabanaki tribal nations, and then it really focuses on building new partnerships for land return, rematriation, this kind of work. I really like the language that First Light has as a collaboration. They formed to rebuild Wabanaki stewardship and presence across the landscape. And as opposed to say, we just want to include some Wabanaki partners in our work, they say that the goal of First Light is actually to restore Wabanaki true prosperity and expand Wabanaki stewardship. That's very different than like, other project-oriented approaches where they're like, we just want more Wabanaki partners. Like this is a deep kind of transformational commitment by these organizations, and it's paying off in really interesting and important ways. So if you visit onlandreturn.org, which is a joint website between First Light and the Wabanaki Commission, you can see this orientation towards land return, and that it's really about centering the tribal nations and the commission in sort of how this work will go forward. And really, obviously, that this critically is about building partnerships with the tribal nations themselves. And so you can see this like recentering voice and returning land, money, decision-making authority, like that's all a part of this decolonial approach by First Light and the work of the commission. Here you can see the First Light delegation leadership. So these are First Light formed its own sort of leadership framework, which is referred to as the delegation. Trust for Public Land is one of these core groups. You can see the other, so you have Maine Coast Heritage Trust, you have TNC. These are the organizations that have really committed time, resources, money into building up this work across the state and with tribal nations here. And then, of course, I talked about the commission being formed in 2021 and how this has led to the possibilities for land return projects like Wáhsehtəkᵂ. And here is the commission, its mission statement is to really improve the health and well-being of Wabanaki people, again, broader than just land return or rematriation, but to really improve, expand our access management, ownership of lands, in support of our land-based cultures. This involves acquiring lands for sharing and co-managing, working with land trusts and conservation organizations, and then really to make a stronger conservation movement that includes and reflects Wabanaki expertise and perspective. Critically, in this First Light vision only came after work in several years as our projects for land return really started to come together and gel. The framework of First Light in terms of its learning journey is to relearn, recenter, and return. Those three ideas like really function to transform the conservation community and their work. But in terms of land return, this vision is that we commit to returning land without cost and without restriction and with a fund to help care for it. So that's like the gold standard of like how does land return really fit into this work for First Light. And then you can see this is just like some organizational chart of like how we try to work together across the commission, the tribal nations, First Light community, and those organizations, which all comes to say we're going to get to talk about one specific project today and how it came into being. But in general, this is also how we do our work. So just gives you like a sense of interdependency in this work. A couple of years ago, First Light was like, okay, now there's a commission, so we can like go away. And then the commissioners are like, no, we're in this work together until all the land is returned. And so we're kind of on the hook of like always working together into the future. And I think that's a really, to me, that's a very Wabanaki Indigenous way of like thinking about share and accountability and responsibility. I don't have time to go into those. These are the first 6 projects that were completed in terms of land return. Had to do with the first land return was from Elliotsville Foundation, And there was another land return related to return of Pine Island to the Passamaquoddy tribe, and then a whole host of other ones with the other tribal nations. This number is now greater than 6, but we started to really think about these projects as a series of 11 projects beyond those original 6 that we've referred to as the tributary land return projects. The Wáhsehtəkᵂ project we'll talk about today forms the bulk of the 52,000 acres, like it's about 30,000 acres of land. So the other 10 projects are amounting to roughly 20,000 acres of land. So that idea of like, what is the typical scale of these projects is usually in the 1,000 or 2,000 acres. The Wáhsehtəkᵂ project is special in its size, but it is part of the larger work of land return that the Commission and First Light are. One thing I try to draw out in terms of thinking about those 2 maps I showed about our land losses and thefts from us, and then conservation, is the Wáhsehtəkᵂ project is connected in place to a certain extent of these 4 townships that the state of Maine took from the Penobscot Nation in the 1830s. It's a kind of a complicated story, but these are 4 townships in the Katahdin region that we had included in treaty negotiations for over 120 years, leading up to then the theft of these townships by the state of Maine in the 1830s. It's a complicated story, but needless to say, it's just like the project that we worked on with Passamaquoddy in terms of the Pine Island return, which is like the state changed the name of the island, so they were able to kind of take it from the Passamaquoddy tribe. Similarly, certain agreements that were made, or agreement to even consider the land purchase, was used by the state of Maine to kind of then seize it through an act of the legislature in terms of these 4 towns. So that gets us to the project that we're going to talk about today. Here, this is 31,000 plus acres of land, 30,000 acres of reacquired by the Penobscot Nation, which I still believe will be the largest collaborative land return effort between the US-based nonprofit and tribal nation. There's a slightly larger land return project, but I think it involves the federal government out west. There's 53 miles of rivers and streams, $32 million. Okay, so we've gone over that. See what's involved in it. Just so you can orient yourself, I have a couple of maps just to say like, where is this land located? It is up towards the Katahdin region. I think it's it's adjoining currently held Penobscot Nation trust lands, and it butts the Katahdin Woods and Waters National Monument. So it actually creates one of the amazing effects of this project is that it will create a kind of conserved and access corridor for Penobscot Nation that we haven't had since in the last 200 years, basically from our home on Indian Island all the way up through the Penobscot River into the East Branch into the Katahdin region. This will now become like a corridor for us to kind of care for and connect to traditional and important places. Just another map that that recent report added in so you can see where it's located and how it's located and connected to the other Penobscot Nation lands, whether they be trust lands or fee simple lands, and you can see how that's connected as well. So, this is oftentimes we give these presentations and it's sort of like, oh, what can I do? How do I support this work? So I preempted that discussion. This is what you can do. Just make the check out to Darren, Ranco. No, you can definitely go to there's a QR code here. You can go that goes directly to the supporting of the Wáhsehtəkᵂ project. You can also look at donlandreturn.org. Again, the First Light Wabanaki Commission joint website in terms of supporting the model, supporting other work that we do in terms of rematriation and land return work. So. See, I made it through. That's the setup for all of the interesting questions that I'm gonna have for friends here. So are there any questions before I ask? I know that we don't like to. Okay, I'll just ask this. So this is this major project. And I want to ask Chuck, because I think you can fill in a lot of the details around, why is the Penobscot Nation doing this project, and what does it mean in terms of our lands, our waters, our culture, that sort of thing?
I think, I'll kind of back up to, when I was first approached about this project, and, Chief just kind of looked at us and make it happen. And then after that, I was talking to James Francis, and he had some, input on the 4 townships. And, this is basically just due to the east of the township, Indian Purchase 3, they call it, or 4, I mean. 4. Yeah. And so that being in that close proximity, that was, I was like, oh, this is really significant. It also kind of encompasses a corridor up along the east branch of the Penobscot, which obviously I didn't have to ask anybody to know if that was significant, but I do pay attention to my work. So, I think the other aspect of the project is, as a tribal hunter and somebody that likes to go out and gather, as well, just being able to be connected to these relatives, to be able to go out and have places to be able to exercise these, subsistence rights that we have as tribal people, I think is really important. And, just having, different areas to do that. This area is also, really close in proximity to the Katahdin region. There's a lot of great things that are going on up there as far as there's a really climate, adaptable place, I guess. I don't know if that's the right word for it, but it has some really high prospects, kind of being maintaining that cold water temperature in that region. I think that was pretty much all I was thinking about on that. But I think, the other aspect I was thinking about was how, interesting it is, for us to have our own land base here, and, to be able to work on that within DNR and study the flora and fauna and know, what the contaminants are and that stuff. So, we have state of Maine hunting license. I can go shoot a deer on my farm if I want and eat that, that's probably more contaminated than anything that I'll get on tribal land. We won't go there. But just knowing, what's in those foods, I think is important. And owning land like this kind of gives us that latitude to be able to do that too. So that's kind of, yeah.
Thanks, Chuck. So Betsy, what does it mean for TPL in terms of its larger work?
Yeah. So Trust for Public Land, we're a national nonprofit organization. We've been around for about 50 years, and sometimes we're described as a conservation organization. I haven't decided how I feel about that. But really our goal is to connect people to the outdoors, to create healthy, climate ready, and more equitable communities. And so all of our work is around connecting people and connecting land, and in this case, reconnecting people and land. And the Mitchell Center goal of well-being of the planet and well-being of people, well-being of the natural world, well-being of people, very much resonates. So, our focus is to put energy towards communities, towards places, towards projects where all of these benefits are going to be realized together. And those benefits include access to food, access to cultural connection, climate resilience benefits for people, for the natural world, and justice and equity benefits as well. So one of our very first projects as an organization was actually working with the Black Panthers in Oakland around creating community gardens. And so the focus on justice and ensuring that there is equitable access to land is really core to who we are. So we started in the early 90s as an organization working with tribal nations and Indigenous-led organizations to bring land back into Indigenous care. And a lot of that work has been out on the West Coast or in Hawaii. And so with the existence of First Light and a lot of the seeds that were planted through the work that Darren shared. You know, we kind of looked at ourselves here in Maine and we're like, why are we not doing this work here? And so had the opportunity then when this land came up for sale to meet with Chuck and Chief Francis and understand whether this was of interest. And so personally, I think there's no more important work for our mission and for the goals of our organization than the work we're doing here. And the why is to create a healthy planet and healthy communities. And as you'll hear, have heard from Chuck and Darren, this is how it happens.
Absolutely. I'll stay with you, Betsy, in terms of thinking about in terms of making this happen, what have been sort of the barriers or opportunities in doing this work? And I know you and I have talked about some of these things, but if maybe you could share with all the other people here, yeah.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think that this probably goes without saying, but I'll say it anyway. Real estate, property, land acquisition, land transfer in the US is built around this certain system of real estate and property law that we've had in place. That's fairly recent history in the grand scheme of things, and very much from a European kind of basis of law. So what that means is that when you're working with land and when you're working with land returns, you're working in that system. And then you are also working with funding that's built around that system too. So a lot of the funding that's available for land acquisition or land conservation, either tribal nations aren't eligible for it, public funding, and there are certain restrictions, which we'll get into, that go against tribal sovereignty and the wishes of Penobscot Nation, tribal nations. And so basically the structures that are in place to do typical land conservation, land protection work have not been built, in my opinion, for land return work. And so you're kind of trying to fit a square peg in a round hole when it comes to funding. And at the scale of a $32 million project, that's a real challenge. And
I think think TPL also is known for smaller scale projects too. So
yeah,
I mean, have there been other projects at this scale in terms of? I know this is big for a land return, but yeah,
I think that's a really good question. Across Maine, probably the biggest project TPL has done is maybe more in the 10 to 20,000 acres. So this is probably the biggest one. And that definitely, I mean, in some ways, I think that it created momentum and excitement within the organization that actually became a big boom to the project.
Yeah.
So there, and I am hoping too that when we're successful, we're able to show here and nationally this can happen at this scale. Land return can happen at the 30,000 acre and not just the 100, 200,000 acre. So
no, that's a good point.
Yeah.
No, that's if you have one project at this size as opposed to 8, the definitely crystallizes people different.
Yeah.
That's awesome. Same question for you, Chuck, in terms of potential barriers and opportunities for this project.
Yeah, I mean, I'd say fundraising is probably hands down the biggest barrier, but I will add, Betsy likes to, ramble on about some of her, some of these, what's the word I'm looking for? Some of her, how difficult this work is, but every time I ask her about something, she's always all in. Like there's a couple other projects. She's like, yeah, let's talk about that. Let's do that. Okay, yeah, we can handle that. So, there's been a couple different things that have come up, and there's trying to pivot on a really small, not really small, but a 500 acre parcel that would kind of complete another piece of land that we have. And I reached out and I was like, hey, this is, or somebody reached out and kind of included you on the email actually. And, I just was like, I don't know why they include Betsy. She's got enough stuff to do, so. Then Betsy was like, yeah, we can help with that. We can get on that. But I think, it's there's a lot of barriers with this type of work. Conservation projects themselves are expensive. The minute you say the C word, I feel like, people think you just got lots of money to kind of blow around and that's, kind of frustrating. I was talking to Bucky Owen Saturday. We were on a trip out on the Penobscot. Well, we're on the Penobscot River and doing a lighthouse tour and a Penobscot River Restoration Trust kind of informative whale watching cruise trip. I guess we weren't really whale watching, but we were on a whale watching boat. Anyway, well, you don't need to know all the details, but Bucky was kind of talking about this project and that they were working on and how there's a piece of land that's coming up that is really expensive. And and he was kind of frustrated by that because they just bought a piece of land right next door to it that wasn't as much money, and I was like, well, the minute that conservation groups interested and involved in that, I feel like every time it's like that dollar sign just keeps getting jacked up a little bit. And I can say that as a
Yeah, you can say that.
as a tribal.
You should try to establish an LLC first and hide its name.
Right. And I think, I think some of the other, hurdles aren't really quite so bad, by like surveys and appraisals. Those are something that have to be done to different specifications depending on what type of money you're using for these projects too. And yeah, and I think, that's why it's important that we work together on these type of projects so that, Betsy's aware of that. Like, okay, we need this special survey done for a mandatory trust acquisition or not even for any trust, fee to trust conversion. So that we have the proper survey done. So we're surveying the piece of land a couple times, and same with the site assessments, et cetera. So, yeah.
And the idea too, also with the transfer at the end, is there is a stewardship fund, right? Design is part of the transfer. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, there is. And that'll get us into a little bit here on,
Yeah.
I think conservation, in my mind, it's not like, sometimes there's a concept of like land is conserved or it's not. And that comes from a mindset of, okay, the deed was transferred to a certain entity or conservation easement was put in place. I feel like what I believe in and am learning more is that conservation comes from the interaction with the land and through caretaking of the land and kind of day one in many ways. When the land is returned to Penobscot Nation, it's not the last step. And so making sure that there's the infrastructure, funding wise, people wise, like what's on the, restriction wise or not restriction wise, to make sure that caretaking can happen, is something that I'm trying to keep in mind. And I should say too, I don't mean to be a downer on the funding. Just trying to motivate other creative funders who might, not be the federal government, but be interested in supporting this work. But it actually has been really awesome and fun to work together too, to get a little bit more creative about what funding sources can support this work that aren't typical land protection sources or not typical, tribal nation funding sources. And we're sort of bringing connections, I think, and resources from our different worlds together to say, there's more benefit here than just conservation or, and that's actually brought more funders out of the woodwork.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think it's, bouncing off what you just said, I think it's really important to think about those relationships that are brought to us through this partnership, like the America the Beautiful Awards. We received two awards for almost $5 million each. And we probably wouldn't have even applied for those if it wasn't for TPL, like kind of bringing it to our attention, like, hey, I think you guys can do this. So I remember the first time it came across my desk, like the year before we applied with you guys for that, for the acquisition portion of the project. And I was like, I don't even know what we're gonna do with this. Like, and then we started talking and, we got the land return work we factored that in, and then it's like, well, there's still, $3 million other dollars here we could go for, and we brought in Dan McCaw and Ben Simpson, our fisheries and wildlife folks, and came up with some really interesting projects to not only, enhance some of the land that the nation holds right now, but also to do some habitat assessments on the Wáhsehtəkᵂ parcel, and kind of, just expand that work. And it's been really good, for sure.
So I know I've buried the lead a little bit, but so why, it was really just draw everyone in. Why pursue this? So I mean, there's serious debate around sort of like even what constitutes land return out there. Like there are all sorts of see, in Maine, we've really driven this like gold standard of without restriction, and I think that idea in terms of the communities, but there's quite differences of opinions on what even counts as land return. But I think, we've set this standard and have worked with, this is definitely coming from the tribal nation. So I'll start with you, Chuck. Like, why land return without restrictions, like especially a conservation easement? I think that's the classic tool when we think about conservation. It limits, certain kinds of development, and that's how easements work, and that's how the river becomes crooked or whatever. But yeah, so why without restrictions like an easement?
Yeah, well, it's a really good question, and this was kind of part of our initial meeting was, that it came out of there that the legal team wanted to return without, any conservation easements on it. And I had to, I was kind of taken back by it. I was like, well, wait a minute, this is going to be so much more difficult. But you also understand why, that is really important is, right now, our trust land holdings, we're only, technically, according to the implementing act, we're only able to hold 150,000 acres of trust land. So if we're adding to our trust land base, like, what is that, if we're adding encumbered lands to it, then we're really kind of, shooting ourselves in the foot before we get started, I guess. And, that's one of the bigger issues, but I think, we're trying to get that changed in the future, but also like, I bought my own piece of conservation, land through an agricultural easement and really started understanding more about some of the little things that pop up that you don't normally think about. And a lot of it, could be, valuations. I mean, the property value goes down a little bit. You can't borrow as much against it, unfortunately. Not that the tribe borrows a lot of money, but I mean, it's something that, you do have to kind of think about that thing as a, as you're owning land. But, and I think it's like the question of stewarding the easements and what does that entail of, working with the Orono Land Trust, and we're, as a department, we're stewarding a little portion of land over there, adjacent to one of our other pieces of trust land that we have. And, I'm kind of learning about what that entails. And I mean, it's not a big lift, but it is, there's definitely some stuff that has to be considered. I mean, there's all kinds of different easements. Some of them don't require a lot of monitoring. Some of them you can, you can work with who you're working, change who you're working with at certain times. But many of the conservation easements with the federal funding that we've looked at were, relying upon state held conservation easement, and that was a non-starter with the tribal government at this current time. Yeah, that's pretty much all I could think of.
Yes, no, that's okay. Betsy, how about you?
Yeah. Well, and when Chuck says that it'd be more difficult, I think that's primarily coming from the place of so many funding, federal and state funding programs are require conservation easement to bring land into a project. And so first and foremost, why no conservation easement is because we are taking our direction from Penobscot Nation as decision makers on this project and every project we do. We are taking our direction from the community that we're partnering with. And so in its simplest answer, that's the answer. But I also was thinking a little bit more kind of big picture on this question, and you know, a conservation easement brings a third party into the relationship with land. And sometimes that's a tool that works well, and sometimes it doesn't. And regardless, there is another party that's involved, and that party's bringing their priorities, their way of working. And there's also kind of a taking of flexibility off the table. When you have something written on paper about land that says you can do this or you can't do that. In my mind, I think that can work. And I also think that that's maybe having a decades, century-long view. And here, where we're talking about thousands of years into the future, you know, maintaining the ability for Penobscot Nation to have flexibility to react to what the land needs, to react to what the community needs, feels like a really strong part of having that reconnection with land. And then the other thing that stood out to me, Chuck's told a story about like federal funding for species restoration often focuses on endangered species and kind of what the federal government has determined is an important species, which may be different or complementary but different to what Penobscot Nation is and DNR is seeing as important species. So when you bring a third party in, there is a different set of priorities coming in, and it doesn't allow for as kind of maybe free or open prioritization and ability for Penobscot Nation or Wabanaki Nations to bring their knowledge and expertise and decision making to how that land is cared for. So that's my working thought right now, informed by a lot. But I want to read one thing here because I think it's to Darren's point, very active kind of debate, if you will. But this is a recent 2 weeks ago study from the Harvard Kennedy School, and one of the intros here says that seeking environmental well-being at the expense of native rights is worse than a false choice. It is a trap that limits and prevents important Indigenous-led approaches to environmental stewardship, harming Indigenous people and the environment in one fell swoop. So I think that, yeah, that it is a false choice in my mind, looking at either the land's conserved or its return to Indigenous nations. Those aren't binaries in my mind.
Yeah, I mean, I think also this, that history, you know, that I went over in terms of land theft and conservation work, you know, I think, you know, this isn't necessarily the case now in terms of what an easement does, but easements have seen as another form of locking us out of our places, right? As Indigenous people for a long time, and it's just part of the property regimes that put the hands of others in control over like what can you do over there, and then even if it's not so strict, it'd be like, hey, what you're gonna do like harm the place, you know? And sort of we're like now we're in this like, oh well, we've been here for thousands of years. We don't want to harm the place, but like, you know, trying to make those sort of statements is, it just doesn't play well in terms of reaching a deal. And so I think this trust building and sort of the purpose of First Light and the commission is to also recognize that certain tools that might make sense to the conservation world don't make sense in a lot of Indigenous contexts as well. But you can reach a lot of the same goals through other means. So I think once we start to peel away some of those things, some of those layers, you actually see, because I think interestingly enough, you know, some of these conservation groups that we now are that the tribes are working with, you know, were testifying against our sovereignty like 15, 20 years ago in the state legislature, now are some of the biggest boosters for our sovereignty and the bills that are trying to fix our sovereignty as it relates to other tribes and the federal government. And you know, I think it's an interesting journey to think like, oh, well, if we just let go of our sense that this is our tool to accomplish this end, you can really learn a lot. And I think that's one of the amazing kind of outcomes of this work, is that just stepping back from like, you know, what is it that we do versus like, what is our goal, is a really important kind of learning part of I think the decolonizing work of the First Light and the organizations involved. And Betsy, you've been there all along and fought for this approach with TPL behind you. So I think it's really critical that we ever sort of recognize that there's been a transfer. We've been trying to return land for quite a while, although it is a new skill. If you're used to losing land, what would you do if you got it returned? So there is these sort of institutional things. I think we learned sort of hard lessons with the Settlement Act, those lands returned. So, we're going at a different pace and a different kind of framework as well. So yeah, I really appreciate all the work you guys are doing. And yeah, we've had some time. Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, sorry.
Please, yeah.
No, I just wanted to say, I think, that 40-year track record of stewardship since the land claims has been, helpful in that, changing people's minds,
That's right.
with our predecessors. So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at, I know you guys are working on the mapping and different projects of like forest lands managed by Penobscot Nation versus the lands around them, you can definitely see, however you want to count it, right? Acre feet or like our forests are definitely some of the healthiest in the state in terms of Penobscot Nation management. So yeah.
I also wanted to bring in that even using kind of the typical tools, there are pretty much every national forest, national park unit, Bureau of Land Management unit, basically any federal conservation land that you would think of doesn't have a conservation easement or any restrictions. The federal government is not willing to accept land with encumbrances. And I have never been a part of a panel that needs to ask or is asking or replying to the question, why Park Service land without a conservation easement?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
just to draw the parallels on that, and that, we're lucky to work with a sovereign nation here who we're working with the US federal government as a sovereign nation that also doesn't have conservation easements.
Yeah,
It's a good point.
but Dave, we're happy to.
Love to let you guys keep going amongst yourselves, but I won't be surprised between anything you've got, William, and people in the room. We've got a few more minutes. I have a bunch of questions, but I'll try to save mine for later and let other folks weigh in. You got anything there, William, you want to bring in?
I think a lot of the questions in the chat have been answered. I think you guys did a great job covering or I guess anticipating what most people ask. But I want one comment asked about, in your presentation, Darren, you showed some statistics about the benefits of land back and rematriation to like the wider state, and places that have done this have seen benefits. You just mentioned that recent Kennedy School article. This commenter wanted you to elaborate a little further on that, and what are sort of the reverberating benefits of this kind of work.
Yeah, I think what's great is much like the 40 years of Penobscot Nation, management of certain lands, you have increasingly in the last decade or more an evidence base around Indigenous, sometimes it's called Indigenous-led conservation, sometimes it's called a bunch of different things, but it's really centering Indigenous governance and land care frameworks as producing, now people are looking around the world, it actually is producing some of the best conservation outcomes, right? This takes some time, and people get caught up in even like, the kind of basically flawed World Bank report of the, whatever it is, 80% of biodiversity is on Indigenous lands or whatever, it's kind of, that's not quite true, but it reflects a reality, it's sort of, it's more true than it is accurate. But I mean, that idea of, see, we live in the Trump world, so that's more important, right? But that idea of this evidence base has really been built up, and I have other presentations where I go into some of the key pieces of this. One thing that I think is a really important shift is like, first of all, conservation work outside of North America is almost vast majority of that work is with Indigenous peoples' input, control, participation. So that is just, it's kind of unique in North America that, it's kind of thought of as mostly without Indigenous people as core decision makers. But I think it's also the shift of the framework by conservation groups too, is that and I've been involved in some of this research, is like human beings, through up until the 1990s, like conservationists just saw like human beings as always the problem. It's that definitely like nature culture dichotomy. And I think the shift in practice around the world has been like, no, it's actually places that get conserved are the ones that people love and care about and are like invested in, as opposed to the ones that someone drew a little fortress map around and said, don't go there and don't do anything with it. Like that transformation though is huge in the kind of mindset or framework of conservation in general. And then when you think about our identity as Indigenous people comes from the places we care for, right? It's like, are we Penobscot without the Penobscot River? Really, no, it doesn't make any sense, right? So that idea of like really investing in that people care about places as opposed to people are deemed not to go in there, right? As a framework of conservation, that transformation is also really, really important.
Thank you.
I'm gonna have to ask a question on the way out because I have to make it back to my building, but so apologies, but I think Chuck had a really offhand comment about this upper limit of 150,000 acres, and that was new information for me. And I was wondering if you could just say a little bit more about that.
So it's in the implementing act that there's certain parcels of land that the nations were able to acquire that were part of the settlement. That was obviously the state's answer to the federal settlement, but so basically, they capped Penobscot Nation at 150,000 acres of trust land. They capped Wáhsehtəkᵂ at 150,000 acres. I'm not sure if Mousy.
I don't think they had a cap.
Yeah, but they only had a really
small fund,
portion
yeah.
of that. Yeah. So they probably weren't afraid of that, but yeah, so we're only able right now, if we were to reach that cap, we would have to amend the implement. So does that answer?
It does. I'm just maybe I shouldn't be shocked at this point, but that's surprising.
Yeah.
Just another category. How is the Maine Indian Claims Settlement Act and the Maine Implementing Act really bad for us? I think hasn't quite worked out that great. Yeah.
With the return of the East Branch Penobscot land, I assume there would need to be a large fund in addition to that purchase. How would that fund change the price tag of land? And is that something that conservation agencies and governments, is that something they could participate in supporting?
Yeah, I mean, there's a number of things that are built in. And Betsy's the best one to talk about because she knows that spreadsheet like the back of her hand. But I do remember, we've had a lot of questions about that. I was once quoted saying that, I'd never seen a person in the tribe that didn't light up as, being really excited about this project. Well, since there's been a couple that have had some questions, and one of those questions is, what's the tax burden going to be on us for the next, as we get that into trust. TPL, has a $50,000 or $250,000, portion of that budget that's gonna, kind of pay for taxes there, and that would be $50,000 a year over 5 years. Basically, was the anticipation of that, which we covered the tax code. Trying to remember how much there were in some. Do you want to speak to that?
Yeah, basically kind of big picture. So the cost of the land is about 29.5 million, and then the fundraising goal is 32.5 million. So there's actually $3 million that's in there to cover staff time, capacity, costs to actually do the land return, both Penobscot Nation and TPL, and then also the kind of stewardship fund, and then taxes and costs for holding the land right now as we're working on it. So it's definitely a critical part of the project. Funders can support all elements of it. Kind of depends on the grant program, but I would say that the other cool thing that Chuck brought up is, finding grant programs like that NIFWIF America the Beautiful one, where there's some money for land return and also money for Department of Natural Resource caretaking. So looking at it even bigger than this project budget, what are the opportunities where we can use the active work to bring money in for needs of Department of Natural Resource and
And there's been a lot of groups that we've met with that weren't necessarily interested in funding land return that have, since subsequently after, a meeting with Betsy and TPL have come to us and said, well, here, we want to have a meeting with you and talk about maybe, funding some of this work and that stuff is, we keep that in the back of our mind too, as we progress. And I got to call one of them pretty soon actually, but for another project.
I mean, in climate resilient work, and cultural work, I know Natalie has been working on thinking about caretaking and cultural responsibility with women, a deep cultural side of like, what does the caretaking look like? I mean, so that's been really important as well. And in some ways, in the newness of it, like that creation of those sort of frameworks is like a real opportunity, I think, for the tribe, in other tribal nations, as land return and land care becomes sort of foundational to the acquisition frameworks that the tribal nations pursue. So yeah, it's really important.
So, yeah,
Quick question. First, thank you all for your work. I'd like to ask, how does the union or even just the tribes in general handle like land remediation? Because I mean these lands are coming from different hands, from different histories. So like I can also understand that tribes have different priorities for what remediation looks like. So what are your experiences?
Yeah, I think, with these lands, that's part of what the habitat assessment is probably gonna tell us. Dan's gotta, I don't know, do you wanna talk about any of that stuff?
Yeah, so I'm Dan McCoy, I work as a fish biologist for the Penobscot Indian Nation, and the one thing that we planned on doing was this is industrial timberland, so there's a massive spider web of logging roads across this landscape, and as a fish biologist, that is disaster in my point of view, because now that means the habitat is broken up into multiple segments. So one of the things that I think about is through that lens of fish, and thinking that these streams need to be reconnected. So what is that? That's road stream crossings, that's culverts and bridges as really kind of a baseline, and then understanding what habitat is there and what other things have happened on that landscape. The log driving that happened on the East Branch for many generations, the habitat is still healing, and it heals more quickly when it is, well, in my perspective, it heals more quickly when there's a conservation-minded organization who owns that, like the Penobscot Nation. So but there are major roadblocks to that healing process that Mother Nature goes through, and sort of by reconnecting the habitat for all these animals, that's sort of the baseline, and then it goes out from there. And we have our forestry, not our forestry, but our wildlife program is also looking at mapping it to understand what for habitat quality and challenges for big game species, and also fur-bearing species and things like that. So that's sort of the base level, is looking at cataloging what is there and then taking them one at a time and restoring and correcting those things. And sometimes that means putting bigger bridges in, or bigger culverts, or arch culverts. Sometimes it means putting these roads to bed, decommissioning a road and letting the forest take over. And that's really, I think, the best always, and also figuring out ways to get people on the landscape. Because when you're there personally and you can see it and you can get access, whether that be walking or driving or whatever that means, then that's a positive connection to leapfrog to other projects.
Of course, a lot of time, but you can also go in there and do a few things, like we're doing some, climate adaptation planning in some of our lands. So that is a possibility in that piece as well in the future.
And I think just to know that the tribes, all the tribes, I think Penobscot Nation is a leader in this, just my pride. But in terms of the department that John Banks built and now Chuck runs, like it really has made huge investments in the infrastructure to even take on a project like this. It's almost like, who could, you know, I'm thinking of like, you know, some of the northern tribes who have smaller land bases, they have smaller departments, they don't have, you know, like, could you go from 1,000 acres to 50,000 acres, you know, overnight? It almost feels like the end of the world of like possibilities. Could you do that? And so I think, you know, it definitely requires this long-term investment in infrastructure that the nation is, you know, Penobscot Nation has made in the department, but also just expertise over many decades building that up in terms of hiring great people like Dan and the other Dan and, you know, all those people that are really important to the work of Penobscot Nation DNR. So like it's you know, I think there's really good and interesting concern that like, is a tribe taking on too much for accepting a land return? But you know, obviously no one's going to be forced into any of this, and the idea that, and that I think TPL was really good at taking its time and considering the relationship building that to make a decision by a tribe, and I think that would be like a best practice out of this. Like a land return project doesn't come up with like one day you're like, hey, you want some land? And then like, yes or no, we're not signing on the dotted line. Like, because there's so much to consider, and we don't, you know, the purpose of land return wouldn't be to like burden a tribe, right? I mean, that's not the point of it, or just to make us feel good as the conservation group, but really discussing like what are the possibilities and what works and doesn't work. And I think again, the head of STEAM and the learning that the First Light organizations have had is that they know that takes some time, and you know, oftentimes that means, you know, a leap of faith by the conservation group and saying, we'll buy it, let's work out the kind of things in the fun, you know, in the meantime. So I think that's also a critical part of this work.
So I'll make a prediction here. If this is anything like the amazing collaborations that have already taken place right here, we're on an island in the middle of the Penobscot River where many of these same partners, Penobscot Nation, the conservation organizations, and lots of others, did some of the most ambitious river restoration via dam removal efforts on the planet. So I think you're hearing again of the kind of vision for this work, the capacity for this work, the ability to learn as you do this work. You guys are right at the early stages of seeing something really breathtaking, and I think it'll serve as a role model for people all over the world. So let's thank everybody again for a great